Hello and welcome to another video in our series regarding important topics in the field of health and exercise. I'm excited to talk about an important aspect of our lives that doesn't get the type of scrutiny it should, and that's the concept of evidence-based information. Within and without the field of health, science has all of a sudden become a funny topic nowadays. Since Copernicus' discovery that the Earth revolves around the sun, rather than the other way around, the scientific enlightenment has since gained steam and has generally become society's primary way of making objectively good decisions in our shared objective reality. In some instances, we still fall short of letting objective measurement be our primary compass towards increasing the world's prosperity, but we at least like to believe that some form of science informs our most important decisions and policies, whether that be the NIH conducting a massive RCT to discover the next miracle drug that cures debilitating disease, or whether it's a toddler burning their hand on a stove, discovering the powerful properties of heat. So, what does science have to do with health? Well, apparently, a lot. Trust the science has been a reverberating slogan these past few years, and although it seems to make sense based on our outcomes recently, it seems to make about as much sense as make America great again. Without getting overly political, my point is that both of these slogans contain abstractions that aren't clearly defined. Now you might be saying, wait, Mike, I know what science is, so why are you saying that? Let me elaborate. Science is defined as the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systemic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. So, science is a fairly broad, encompassing idea. The toddler burning their hand on the stove is conducting an experiment. This relates back to Tyranny of Words. As you proceed through your life, you are downloading an abundant amount of experiences. These experiences are a primary manner of learning. Not the only, of course, but certainly your personal experiences matter in regards to how you make your decisions. It's not the most evolved form of science, but you observing reality or nature and learning about it, or downloading referent experiences, determines many aspects of how you live your life. This is the foundation of science, making observations about reality. From there, we have other ways of gaining knowledge, of which the definition can be debated, but for now, can be defined generally as what is already known about the world. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't have to experience something to know about something. For example, I know that plants absorb energy through the sun's rays and conduct a process known as photosynthesis to gain energy and sustain their existence. Now, did I test this myself? Did I perform an experiment where I put some plants in the dark and some plants in the sun and see which fared better? No, I did not. I learned this information through humanity's collective knowledge that's already been determined by people who have studied and experimented within that field of science. These shortcuts are necessary. You can never know everything there is to know. You can never do everything there is to do. I, as an individual, cannot conduct a randomized controlled trial to determine the decisions that I should make about every aspect of my life. I wouldn't live long enough for that to work. It's necessary in some instances to trust the science. In this context, trusting the science makes sense, but what we have to remember is that even very good science can only account for so many variables of reality at once. Practical science, an objective measurement that can be repeated over and over with the same result, outside of paper, still matters. Ego-driven credentialism is rampant in today's over-intellectual society, where we're spending too much of our time indoors and less of our time observing nature in real time. On top of that, sometimes science gets things horribly wrong. But before the conclusions proving the hypothesis incorrect can come to light, the scientific establishment develops a propaganda story that influences the masses to incorrect conclusions that can have far-reaching consequences. I'll take this opportunity to say that if you haven't read Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, you should, as it gives an articulate overview as to why we have to be more precise with prevailing comprehensive narratives and why getting people on the same page about objective thought is so challenging. Back to the scientific establishment. The other danger with quickly coming to a scientific consensus is that corporate interests will in many instances influence the information that's propagated by otherwise honest scientists. Let's look at a brief example, the famous Ancel 7-country study and the demonization of saturated fat and cholesterol. Ancel Keys was a scientist from the 1950s that ran a multivariate analysis on many countries to determine whether there was a link between saturated fat and heart disease. After publishing his data from 7 countries that confirmed his bias and ignoring the other data, the scientific community ran with the notion that saturated fat is bad for you, and instead encouraged the food industry and health institutions to encourage the use of seed oils and trans fats. Ouch. Trans fats. I likely don't even have to go into why they're horrible for your health and are now banned by the FDA, but this is pretty upsetting on several levels. One, things like fries and burgers and other foods that are considered bad used to be cooked in animal fats like butter and beef tallow, which is not only tasty, but several of magnitudes healthier to cook with due to the fact that it doesn't oxidize easily. So that means if the scientific establishment had just shut up, we would probably be significantly healthier now. And you and I wouldn't have to avoid eating at 99.99% of restaurants that all cook with cheap seed and vegetable oils. Two, it took the FDA decades after the fact to ban trans fats. That's an entire generation of people whose lifespans were likely shortened by the incorrect information. Not only that, but the American Heart Association still recommends heart-healthy seed oils and continues to demonize saturated fat. One more quick fun fact. The NIH actually held what they called a consensus conference in 1986 to approve their conclusions that dietary recommendations should suggest low-fat diets to the general public. There was hardly a consensus, as several experts agreed that data had been manipulated to come to the wrong conclusions in regard to saturated fat and cholesterol. Could it be that perhaps the investors who had already busted out the bubbly didn't want their profits from their successful prescription statins to go awash? Saturated fat, cholesterol, and seed oils is an entirely separate rabbit hole we can get into, and we'll do a video on that later on. But you better believe that financial interests also fueled the propagation of the wrong information. Science is not above this, and it's the perfect example as to why you want to utilize effective critical thinking and common sense when interacting with the latest scientific research to inform your decisions. This is actually another great reason to research Jacque Fresco. I'll be referring to him a lot throughout the series. He talks about what's called differential advantage. Take a look at many of his free lectures on YouTube. So hopefully, I've demonstrated something here as it pertains to science. Even science, with as solid of a definition as Google provides, still has some contextual interpretation involved. No two moments in time are the same. The science that's appropriate for cellular biology may not be the appropriate type of science that's necessary for an architect or a social worker. This is important to keep in mind when we hear trust the science from anyone, even well-known institutions. We could go further down the rabbit hole of abstraction in science, but we need to get closer to the point of what this video is about. So, we have to talk about a procedural aspect of academic science that's also important in regards to problems with trust the science, and that is peer review. Many of us are familiar with scientific studies, mostly through the media. For example, headlines that say, "Is red wine actually good for you?" or 12 important benefits of fish oil, usually include some sort of scientific studies that justify their points. These studies are typically what's known as peer-reviewed. So, what's the peer review process and why does it matter? Well, peer review is a process in academia where other experts in the same field as you review your work and/or study, and this becomes a large determining factor into whether or not it's published. This sounds great. We don't want any misinformation out there, and we have to make sure that studies have sound methods and accurate reporting of data. In theory, this should help improve the quality of the science that's being published. But recently, there's been an outcry in the scientific community about the quality of the science being published in scientific journals. In this case, we want to direct you to an important study conducted by John Ioannidis entitled "Why Most Published Research is False." The study states, "There is increasing concern that most current published research findings are false. The probability that a research claim is true may depend on study power and bias, the number of studies on the same question, and importantly, the ratio of true to no relationships among the relationships probed in each scientific field. Simulations show that for most study designs and settings, it is more likely for a research claim to be false than true. Moreover, for many current scientific fields, claimed research findings may often be simply accurate measures of the prevailing bias. Strong words by Ioannidis. Johns Hopkins issued a response to Ioannidis' work, and although they stated that the claim that most research findings are false for most research designs and for most fields must be considered as yet unproven, they conceded that we agree with the paper's conclusions and recommendations that many medical research findings are less definitive than readers suspect, that p-values are widely misinterpreted, that bias of various forms is widespread, that multiple approaches are needed to prevent the literature from being systematically biased, and the need for more data on the prevalence of false claims. So, although there are responses in the scientific literature to Ioannidis' claim, if you look deeply, you will find that there are at least some concessions to the points he's trying to make, even by the scientific medical establishment. That's just about the results of the studies overall. We have to look at another problem with the peer-reviewed medical literature, the independent replication crisis. The replication crisis, also called the replicability crisis and the reproducibility crisis, is an ongoing methodological crisis in which it has been found that the results of many scientific studies are difficult or impossible to reproduce. Because the reproducibility of empirical results is an essential part of the scientific method, such failures undermines the credibility of theories building on them and potentially call into question substantial parts of scientific knowledge. An article from the scientific journal Nature titled 1,500 Scientists Lift the Lid on Reproducibility has a few concerning statements that should be acknowledged. At the current time, there is no consensus on what reproducibility is or should be, but just recognizing that is a step forward. The next step may be identifying what is the problem and to get a consensus. People give functional patterns a lot of flack for constantly suggesting people read Tyranny of Words. I'm of the opinion that a lot of people like to be spoon-fed and aren't intellectually curious, so they generally just don't like to read. And then also, when any one group of people suggests reading a book, people are likely assuming that it's just some sort of groupthink and that we're trying to infringe on the concept of individualism. But it looks like this is a time in our lives when science really needs Tyranny of Words, because that's what it's about, reproducibility. If I drop this whiteboard marker 4,982 times, it will probably fall the 4,983rd time. Maybe not, but probably. I'm not saying that sophisticated science isn't more complicated than that, but if we're to conduct real science that's reliable and helps us make decisions in our shared objective reality, then results should be reproducible by an order of operations. The previous statement from Nature is saying there's not a real consensus on what reproducibility even is. Let that sink in. And give that a quick thought the next time you're demanding peer-reviewed research on something like nutrition, or whether drinking a glass of wine every day is good for your heart, or hopefully it'll make you think twice before listening to the American Heart Association's recommendation to eat heart-healthy PUFAs. Yuck. This is exactly why Tyranny of Words is so important. It is very, very difficult to get people on the same page about words and about what matters. Here's another fun statement from the same article. A minority of respondents reported ever having tried to publish a replication study. When work does not reproduce, researchers often assume there's a perfectly valid and probably boring reason. What's more, incentives to publish positive replications are low, and journals can be reluctant to publish negative findings. In fact, several respondents who had published a failed replication said that editors and reviewers demanded that they play down comparisons with the original study. So it comes down to hierarchical pressure. The truth of it is, people are naive when it comes to how science is conducted. Many people think that the scientists that are conducting these experiments and studies and the editors of scientific journals only care about the objective truth and not their paychecks, how well the study is received, other financial incentives, bias towards predisposed frames of thought or reference, their position on academic or social hierarchies, etc., etc., etc. The truth is, these people are human just like you and me, and are subject to the same level of bias and social influences that in many instances are no less mature than your typical high school social BS. Another statement from the same article, a biochemistry graduate student in the United Kingdom who asked not to be named, says that efforts to reproduce work for her lab's projects doubles the time and materials used, in addition to the time taken to troubleshoot when some things invariably don't work. Although replication does boost confidence in results, she says, the costs mean that she performs checks only for innovative projects or unexpected results. Okay, now, here's a really important segue. In a society that's used to making money online or doing their work from home or at a coffee shop or being a social media influencer, people are heavily removed from many things, but two things specifically: how hard it is to make things, or manufacturing, and how hard it is to pay for large-scale important things, such as scientific research. I've talked a lot about problems with the scientific literature in general. Now I'm going to be getting into more specifically what's happening in the fitness industry and confounding variables in clinical studies regarding exercise. There are way more problems with studies in the field of exercise and nutrition likely than almost any other industry outside of psychology for obvious reasons I won't go into here. But before we even address them, we have to talk about how much research costs. Here's a hint, it's not cheap. That's why I mentioned people being removed from making things and how much things cost previously. You see, people like to demand things without any thought about what's required for it to happen. Most people will never have to organize, fund, and then calculate the results of a large-scale scientific study. Let's take a look at a study funded by the NIH, which had a 2018 budget of over $37 billion, in order to help us determine what kind of financial resources are required for a comprehensive study on the effects of aerobic exercise. I'm very grateful to one of the members of our team for finding the study because the data on the cost of research is not widely available, and this one was comprehensive. The study states, large clinical trials of exercise are expensive, particularly when administering several visits to assess study aims. Outcome assessments, specifically those involving neuroimaging, accounted for a significant proportion of total costs in this analysis. Future investigators must budget accordingly if they wish to conduct a comprehensive, multi-site exercise intervention trial that examines numerous physiological and psychological outcomes. Now, neuroimaging is indeed expensive, and not every exercise trial will require it, but if the cost per participant, as the study states, is $16,494, and we cut that amount in half, or even a third, we're still taking thousands of dollars per participant. Another thing to consider, this is for a 12-month trial. What if we wanted a study of this scale for over a year? What about 2 or 3 years? You could see how the costs add up quick. Just multiply 16,494 by 3 and you can get the total and per participant cost, and it's pretty aggressive. On top of that, what if we wanted to replicate the study? Now we have to incur the costs all over again. The truth is, guys, only large institutionally funded research programs can handle these kinds of costs, which is why I mentioned the NIH's $37 billion budget previously. Or pharmaceutical companies, which I won't even get into the problems with that in this video. Or you have to go through the process of getting a grant, of which the hierarchical navigation of being awarded one can be difficult to overcome. In other words, conducting good science is harder than we thought. It requires large-scale organization, accounting for many variables: equipment, salaries for participants and those conducting the studies. You could see why this leaves a large room for error and human psychological bias. Okay, one last point about the literature. When it comes to producing useful information and practical application that's outside of what we already know, it's slow. Not just moderately slow, it's slow as hell. Remember all the moving parts of the study I mentioned previously? The cost associated with this type of research At the moment, there's not really a way to move this along. That's why innovative companies are able to move fast and break things at a breakneck pace, way past the institutional speed. Private enterprises can usually, with reason, move past the red tape and get things done faster. If you want to wait for research to make certain decisions, expect to be waiting a while. So there's room for improvement with peer-reviewed medical literature. We don't need to get into the black and white saying that all studies can't be trusted or that clinical research should be considered absolute. Everything has its place, and once again, science is contextual. But we've noticed a trend in the fitness industry that follows the overall trend of trust the science that should be addressed. Health gurus pushing specific agendas utilizing peer-reviewed research to justify their claims. Now, you might be thinking, why would having a scientific study to back up your claims be a bad thing? Well, it's not inherently bad per se, but as we've demonstrated, if many research findings are false, remember, Ioannidis' claim that it could be upwards of 50%, then the utilization of studies doesn't exactly inspire great confidence, especially when it comes to making decisions about your body and health. Not to mention the other points we mentioned previously. So let's take a look at another study to see what the confounding variables are when it comes to the literature. Let's look at an aspect that's directly relevant to FP. Do studies show that movement dysfunction is correlated with pain and injury? Well, as you may suspect, it's a mixed bag of results, depending on the study you look at, the type of methods used, and what variables they're accounting for. So then, why do we focus on movement at FP? Are we ignoring the highest level of evidence as suggested by the scientific establishment's hierarchy of evidence? Why not just trust the systematic reviews of notable institutions? Before I get into that, I'm going to interject with something. I think the hierarchy of evidence model is okay, but there's an aspect of it that I think needs to be addressed, and that's that it leads people to assume that there isn't anything outside the hierarchy of evidence that can be useful. Now, some clinicians will say that's not true, that they rely on published research and then anecdotal clinical experience if there's no research. That makes sense on a cursory level. But if there's no research on a methodological way of producing results that works very well, then you'll be stuck relying on the published research, which in a few years could easily be proven wrong. Why wouldn't you just directly test the variable in real time and save yourself and your clients a lot of time? This hierarchy of evidence argument is problematic. If there was a method out there that say, if you hold your breath for 14 hours, that will cure your back pain, yes, I would ignore that and not subject my client to that experiment. But if there was a method that was helping people objectively a lot, over and over again, repeatedly, and was based on logically sound first principles, I would at least try it before subscribing to saying, no, I'm going to wait on published research, which is slow, before I try anything else that may help my patients get better. So, back to movement. Let's take a look at a common postural/movement dysfunction known as scapular dyskinesis. If you look at studies, many of them will say that scapular dyskinesis doesn't correlate to shoulder injury, although some will. For example, this study in particular has been quoted by Physios who take the scientific literature very well literally. It's titled, "Scapular Dyskinesis is not an isolated risk factor for shoulder injury in athletes, a systematic review and meta-analysis." Let me insist in understanding what a systematic review and meta-analysis is and why researchers do it. You see, studies have a certain statistical power, which is dependent on certain numerical factors such as the sample size. Remember, large-scale longitudinal studies are expensive, and that's why there aren't that many of them. So, in order to help with that problem, researchers take a conglomerate of studies and analyze them in order to increase the overall sample size of the hypothesis, or null hypothesis in this case, being addressed. So by doing a systematic review, they are increasing the statistical power of the study. Remember, the study by Ioannidis, who is stating that statistical power was an important part of determining whether studies are true or false. In addition to systematic reviews, researchers will conduct meta-analysis in order to provide an overarching trend amongst many studies. This study is both a systematic review and meta-analysis, so, according to clinicians, it is high on the scale of the hierarchy of evidence. But I'm going to give you a look as to why that unfortunately doesn't really mean much. Let's look into this study a little bit more. Shoulder injuries account for 20% of all competitive sports. 75% are recurrent and can lead to prolonged time away from sport. More severe injuries warranting surgical intervention may result in prolonged or incomplete return to previous competitive performance. If what we were doing for athletes was working, wouldn't these numbers be lower? If what we were doing was working, why do 75% of injuries reoccur? The numbers are not promising for our current interventions. Further, numerous studies have investigated risk factors for shoulder injuries in athletes, such as changes in training load, decreased shoulder external rotation muscle strength, range of motion deficits, and scapular dyskinesis. However, the findings of previous studies of risk factors for shoulder injury are inconsistent. It is possible that the lack of consistency reflects the complex nature of injury, sport-specific demands on the shoulder, and insufficient study sample sizes. So, this is part of what we're talking about with scientific research. Studies are generally inconsistent and difficult to reproduce. This review is admitting that. Now, of course, that's what they are trying to address here. By doing a review and meta-analysis, they can take a look at many studies and try to determine a statistical significance. I could break down this study more fully, but we don't want this video to be hours long. Let me highlight a few more key points here. As the title states, the results of the studies analyzed were as follows. The presence of scapular dyskinesis displayed a trend to increase the risk of shoulder injury, but this was not statistically significant. Okay, cool. What does this tell us? Let's say I'm a physio and I consider the scientific literature to be the highest in regards of hierarchy of evidence. Do I say scapular dyskinesis doesn't matter? Should I ignore when someone has scapular winging, since this study is stating there's only a trend towards injury, but not a significant statistical significance? Do I actively discredit a method that's solving the movement/postural dysfunction, even if it has thousands of results of people experiencing a reduction of pain and increased quality of life because of it? Let me highlight another line from this study. Another possible explanation for the results observed in this study is that dichotomization of scapular control into normal or dyskinesis may be too simplistic to identify if scapular dyskinesis predisposes athletes to the development of shoulder injury. Clarkson et al., referring to another review or study, demonstrated that obvious scapular dyskinesis, not slight scapular dyskinesis, imposed a statistically significant increased risk for shoulder injury. Additionally, Kawasaki et al., likely another review, detailed that only the subset of scapular dyskinesis involving excessive scapular elevation was associated with increased injury risk. Consequently, performing a meta-analysis that accounted for the severity or type of scapular dyskinesis may have resulted in an altered outcome. However, the heterogeneity of dyskinesis classifications used across the studies made this impractical. In other words, it's hard to accurately account for the varying spectrums of scapular dyskinesis in a systematic review. Spectrums, severity, and orders of magnitude matter, and they are difficult to account for in a broad array of studies, rather than doing a single study with unified methods and assessments. One more very important factor that the study concedes: the development of sports injuries is complex and multifactorial, and it has been suggested that injuries do not arise from linear summations of predictive variables, but rather from complex interactions among multiple factors. In other words, scapular dyskinesis could be a factor in conjunction with other factors, but if those factors aren't tested or reviewed, then how do we know? Also, what about scapular dyskinesis and back pain, or neck pain, or ribcage compression, etc., etc., etc.? Here's my point. People like to throw these studies around and say that so-and-so isolated variable doesn't matter, and then throw the baby out with the bathwater. The truth is, even a meta-analysis or systematic review has its limitations, and I would argue that those limitations are large in number. The thing is, most of the studies suggest and concede to what I'm saying. It's just clinicians like to throw these studies around as if they are the be-all end-all, and they are just absolutely not. Another point I'm going to make when it comes to these studies and literature that evidence-based clinicians like to use, they fail to recognize that as science evolves, the results often change. For example, this review was done because a previous study determined that there was a correlation between scapular dyskinesis and injury. Now this review is saying that there is not. What if a few years later the criteria changes, higher quality studies with stronger statistical power emerge, and another systematic review shows a correlation once again? This is the problem with aspects of academia and the scientific establishment. We will never reach utopia. We will never know every unknown unknown. Things evolve. Clinicians and nutritionists throw around studies suggesting a consensus when a consensus has not been reached. One more paragraph from this study I really want you guys to think hard about. There is an emerging hypothesis that scapular dyskinesis may just represent the spectrum of normal kinematic variation. This is supported by the higher prevalence of scapular dyskinesis in overhead athletes and the degree of kinematic variability seen in other motor tasks, such as gait. However, the association of scapular dyskinesis with anterior capsular strain, rotator cuff tendon changes, and compressive load on the glenohumeral labrum shows that kinematic changes to scapular motion may not be benign adaptations to overhead load and may lead to the development of shoulder injury over time. Let's think about this. The last sentence is saying that scapular dyskinesis may not be benign, but because we can't prove it with this systematic review, we're going to go ahead and say that it's probably within the normal spectrum of what's just going to happen with overhead athletes, even though in the last sentence we're going to say that there's an association with all the other variables that can lead to shoulder injury. So what's really happening here, guys? We just talked about how this study, however high in esteem it may be held in the literature, it may be, does not account for enough variables to rule out scapular dyskinesis when it comes to pain. Are we moving towards normalizing dysfunction? Just because we see it a lot, does that mean it's normal? Is ever increasing diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease normal? Autoimmune disorders? Cancer? Scoliosis? Low back pain? Are we weaponizing credentialism to lower the bar so we can make our jobs easier? Use your intuition, friends. We're going to need a part 2 to this video. Maybe it will be an ongoing part of this series. What I will say to you now, beware of anyone who normalizes pain. This train of thought is consistently leading to drop the bar lower and lower and lower in regards to clinical rehabilitation and training. Credentialism is the enemy of innovation. I hope that this has been somewhat enlightening. Unfortunately, that's all I'm going to get into for today because it's a rabbit hole of information. There is no perfect study. There is rarely unified consensus in science. We must be open to practical observation of nature when it comes to our methods and take paper studies with a grain of salt. Don't be afraid of your intuition. Speaking of which, my last recommendation for today would be to take a look at Jacque Fresco's lecture titled What the Future Holds Beyond 2000 on YouTube. Hopefully, you'll see why it relates to our current agenda of trusting the science and instead take a lifelong approach of learning to think for yourself. This is Mike Mucciolo signing off and asking you to keep thinking intentionally and not habitually.